Good morning, everyone. We'll give participants a few minutes to connect to the webinar, and then we'll get started in a minute or two. Thanks for your patience. Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Corcoran, the Director of Information Services for All Chicago, and welcome to the May Agency Technical Administrator meeting. The lines are muted. If you have questions, please put them in the question boxes, or question box, I'm sorry. And if you have the option in your question box, please click the send to all so everyone can see what the question is. So when we answer it, we can make sure everyone knows what the topic is. The agenda for today's meeting, I'm going to go through some of the HMIS standards update that were published week before last. Talk about the recently completed data quality process, some updates on duplicate client merges and client record locks, and an update on some other training activities. Benicia, yes, the slides will be emailed. I converted to a PDF and sent it out right after the meeting is done. There aren't a lot of items on this agenda, but particularly for the data standards, it's quite a volume of data to get through. So with that, we'll get started. We've shown this slide before. This is from the HUD TA group. They have a monthly HMIS lead webinar. And in May, HUD is supposed to release the data standards materials HMIS manual, partners manual, things like that on the HUD Exchange. They have done that. And this is all in anticipation of a go live of October 1st for the new 2024 HMIS data standards. For those of you unfamiliar, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has a standard for what data is contained within the homelessness management information system. Those standards get updated every 2 years. And this is one of the years when they get updated, and they have recently published, after some discussion with different stakeholders and interested parties, they've now published what the new data standard will be effective this October. As I said, they've released the data standards documentation. There's a website called HUD Exchange where the documents are published. Anyone can go there and look at them. The documents that have been recently published are the fiscal year 2024 HMIS Data Dictionary, the fiscal year 2024 HMIS Data Standards Manual, and a supplemental document called the HMIS C4 Translation Assistance Needed Supplement. And as we go through the list of changes, it'll become clear what that last document is about. Betsy has a question. Do I know whether the data will have an impact on the RHY HMIS uploads? I don't know that specifically. What HUD has done is publish the standards, what the reporting changes are and things like that. We can specifically ask both the HUD TA and our vendor WellSky to see what those changes will be. But what's supposed to happen is that if you use one of the vendor supplied reports to do the upload, those reports should reflect these data standards changes, and the upload mechanism should also reflect the data standards changes, but we can find out specifically. Back on the timeline, so what's happened is that to more fully answer your question, Betsy, or at least give a little more explanation around it, what's happened is that HUD has published the data standards. Now, over the next several months, all the HMIS vendors are going to be implementing those changes, both in the user interface and the database and all the reporting and things like that. We don't know what that looks like until they publish their sandbox. The last time this happened, all the changes were made available on September 30th. So we didn't have a lot of time to go through things and all that kind of stuff. So there may be a little bit of a fire drill nature to it if that happens again. But right now what's happened is that data standards have been published, all the various impacts and things like that. I don't know that we have all of that information yet. So for the 2024 data standards changes, there are several changes made to project information, what's known as PDDE in the data standard world, the project descriptor data element. They're removing the emergency shelter tracking method and renaming the emergency shelter night by night to an existing emergency shelter response option 1, adding a response emergency shelter entry exit. They're adding a rapid rehousing subtype field, adding RRH services only subtype to an affiliation field, removing the HMIS participating project field from this element, and they're creating a new element for HMIS participation status. And for the target population, they're changing it from domestic violence victim to survivor of domestic violence in the target population. For the most part, these shouldn't impact a lot of things that happen in terms of data entry or day-to-day operation, but there will be some changes in how projects are defined in the system. For funding sources, they're removing the HUD COC joint component, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, removing the Rural Housing Stability Assistance Program, adding in 3 new ones having to do with ESG Rush, Unsheltered Special NOFO, and the Rural Special NOFO. We don't do a great job of maintaining the funding sources. But again, these are things that should be defined and assigned for each project. So there may be some follow-up to put in valid funding sources if the ones that are being eliminated affect your particular projects. Bed and unit inventory, they're changing the project type applicability for rapid rehousing to only be the PH rapid rehousing, RH housing with or without services subtype. So there may be some changes we need to make for the rapid rehousing projects, depending on how our vendor maps those things over from the old version to the new. There's a new data element for tracking HMIS participation and the ability to track whether there's a comparable database for domestic violence projects. And there's a new data element for the project descriptor data element to identify projects that are acting as access points and projects that accept referrals from coordinated entry. There's significant changes to coordinated entry that we'll get to a little bit later on. And in order to support those, we need to identify which projects are access points and projects that accept referrals from coordinated entry. I think this will be a manual mapping exercise. I don't think there's any existing data in the HMIS that will tell which these are. So that's part of the maintenance of the projects we'll have to do as we look at updating the coordinated entry piece of it. PDDE is project descriptor data element. So for the HUD data standard, they split things up into things that are associated with clients, things that are associated with projects, things that are universal data elements, things that are project specific data elements. So they love acronyms. So PDDE is just project related data. I'll pause here. Any other questions on any of the project changes? And again, we have not read through every single word and line in the data standards manual yet. And again, we need to wait to see how WellSky implements some of this stuff in Service Point, also known as community services. Is the audio back on? Okay, thank you. Oops. So we may not be able to answer questions in detail, but if you have any questions on the project part, now would be a good time to ask them. Okay. Yes, Nikki, we will be emailing that. I'll be emailing this out to everyone who was invited to the webinar, and we'll post it along with the recording of this on the help desk where we normally post the any of the meetings, the recording and all the materials for the meetings. So for the universal data elements, there's some major changes here. What were formerly two different attributes for a client, race and ethnicity, are now being combined into a single element called race and ethnicity. Okay, Juanita, we'll get to that question. So there's a new element called race and ethnicity, and the old element for ethnicity is being retired. There is a mapping exercise to map the client's current race and ethnicity into the combined element. And adding response options for Middle Eastern and North African, and adding Hispanic, Latina, EO, and adding a text box where there could be more descriptive information about the client's race and ethnicity. The gender element is changing female to woman, girl of child, changing male to man, boy of child, changing gender other than to non-binary, adding a culturally specific identity, and adding different identity in a text box to add more detail. Leah has a question about, is race and ethnicity going to be single or multi-select? I believe it's going to remain multi-select, but again, we haven't seen the implementation there, so it should be multi-select. Ariel, when you say post the link, do you mean in the chat? Thank you, Rochelle. For destination, removing the or RHY funded from one of the fields, separating temporary and permanent situations into separate headers. I believe that has to do with the pick list that appears as to which destinations are temporary and which ones are permanent. Reorganizing the response options under those headers, renumbering the responses by adding a standard number to the beginning of each response based on category, and adding dependencies for permanent subsidized options, which is going to be dependent logic depending on which prior thing was selected. Client destination is changing the element name to enrollment COC, changing the data collection stage to project start only. Actually, this is client location, not client destination. I'll correct that. And update the data collection instructions to tell users to record the COC code of the project funded to assist the participant. And for prior living situation and current living situation, they're adding dependencies for the permanent subsidized options. So more selections based on what the selection was. Pause again for questions on changes to the universal data elements. For other assessments and sub-assessment questions, for health insurance, they're changing one of the responses to say the Veterans Health Administration. For current living situation, again, adding dependencies for permanent subsidized options. A big change is for coordinated entry. The coordinated entry assessment and the coordinated entry event are being retired and replaced by a new coordinated entry activity. The new coordinated entry activity is for tracking, screening, assessments, and other coordinated entry activity in a single element. This is going to be a major change in how data is collected for coordinated entry and how it's reported. For all enhanced yes, no pick list items, the client refused response is being changed to client prefers not to answer. For an appendix in the data standard, the living situation option list, again, they're grouping things a little bit different in terms of permanent and temporary destinations. That's being changed. The well-being data element is being retired. There's a new element being introduced called translation assistance needed. It's new to assist COCs with identifying if clients need translation assistance, and if so, what language. Among the documents that we first talked about was in a separate document listing the 300 language options. So that's the last thing on this list, that those languages supported are listed in that translation assistance list of languages document referred to in the first slide. So Betsy Carlson has a question. So CE assessment is part of intake. I'm confused by the CE activity idea. HUD requires currently that, and we've implemented it in two different assessments. One is called the CE event, and the other is called the CE assessment. The Coin and Entry assessment currently is a sub-assessment that's part of the standardized housing assessment. The CE event is a separate separate assessment, actually separate sub-assessment and a different assessment. Those two are supposed to be performed when a client presents for coordinated entry. I don't think they're being filled out as regularly as we would like, but that's where those two assessments live right now. And we're going to need to replace that process and implement the new coin and entry activity as part of probably the standardized housing assessment for the folks that do, probably the skilled assessors that do coin and entry assessments. Does that answer your question, Betsy? Sal Munoz asks, is C4 translation assistance going to be applied to all projects, or is this specific to a certain project type? I believe it is, again, we'll have to see how it's implemented. I believe it's part of all assessments, probably primarily as an entry assessment thing, but my understanding is that it's part of all the assessments, Sal. Other questions on any of the Section 4 and global changes? A few other things for project-specific data elements. For HOPWA, they're removing the word disorder from the substance use services treatment response. For medical assistance, receiving public HIV/AIDS medical assistance field and dependency responses. For the housing assessment at exit, update response 7 to say jail, prison, and response 10 to say deceased. For sexual orientation, the HUD COC PH Permanent Supportive Housing to Funder program component will be required to collect that data. The RHY service connections, the response label change is being changed from mother to client person who gave birth. For the project completion status, the response labels will be changed from youth to client. For counseling, rephrase, field will enable client to receive counseling instead of counseling received by client. The worst housing situation is being retired. For veterans information, Space Force is being added to the response options. For SSVF services provided, response 7 is being changed to shallow subsidy. For financial assistance for SSVF, there are multiple changes. Field 1 is will be labeled as start date of financial assistance. Response 15 will be changed to shall subsidy financial assistance, adding landlord incentive, adding tenant incentive, and adding a new field, end date of financial assistance. Is anyone or everyone having difficulty hearing? Okay, Rachel is saying that the audio is bad. She can't hear. I don't know exactly how to fix that. Okay, thank you, everyone. Any questions on these change items? And the last set, there's a change in the percent of AMI for the SSVF eligibility. The responses in field 1 will be changed to the list that you see on the screen there. The last permanent address is being retired. Homelessness prevention targeting criteria, changing the dependency under C to past experience of homelessness. Change dependency D to head of household is not a current leaseholder or renter of unit. Change dependency E to head of household has never been a leaseholder or renter of unit. And change dependency N to single parent guardian household with minor children. And a new item is being added for implementation identifier. This is more of a system component. There's going to be an identifier added that assigns unique value to each HMIS implementation to support export management and client deduplication. So that's more for data exchange and for identifying the systems for HUD and between systems as opposed to anything that would be user visible. Any questions? So that's basically a summary of all of the changes that are being made. So what does that mean in terms of what we need to do between now and October 1st? We expect that there will be around 40 new standard HUD assessments released by WellSky when they release the version that has all these changes in it. Since our COC has added custom questions to most of those standard assessments, we'll have to do editing on each one of those assessments to add in the custom questions as a revised version of the new HUD assessments. Some of our custom assessments also contain standard HUD questions, and we need to go in and edit those to replace the old questions with the new. Once everything's edited, the old assessments need to be removed from each project and the new assessments assigned to each project. And we don't know when WellSky will release the version with the new data standards implemented in them. So we don't know when we will be able to figure out how much of that work there is to do and how much time we'll have to actually do that implementation so that we meet the October 1st deadline. Also, we need to look at all of the custom reports to utilize and implement the changes to the new data standards. Some of the changes that we just went through that will affect reporting, the combination of race and ethnicity for most of our reports, those are two separate columns. with specific values that may be tested or certain field links that are available to display that data. Changes to the living situation and destination. We have some outcome reporting that looks at whether it's a permanent or temporary or institutional type of destination, and those might change. The change of response from client refused to client prefers not to answer. We have in some of our reporting a grouping of basically data not collected, client refused, things like that, that all fall under a no response category or things like that. So we'll have to make changes to that logic in the reporting to now include the client prefers not to answer. The coordinate entry changes, again, are going to be substantial in terms of what particularly the intake looks like for clients going into coordinate entry. The changes to inventory may affect some of our inventory reporting and doing things like the point in time count or the HIC processing and things like that. So we'll have to take a look at that. And the rapid rehousing project type change, we may have to do some of that stuff manually and make sure we understand the impact on any reporting, again, of inventory or other project related data. We can't implement the reporting changes until the new version is released because the data and the field names and things like that aren't part of the database until it's actually released. The report changes may require consultation with recipients. It's a broader list than this, but in particular, things like the DFSS monthly and quarterly reporting comes to mind. We do data extracts for Urban Labs and other folks. So between now and October, we may need to sit down as we do our scoping of what the report issues are to see how we want to implement things like the combination of race and ethnicity and how that impacts other splits that are done for other reporting within the city or other ways that people use that data. Some of the quarterly and monthly reporting is due only days after the 1st of October. So depending on when we get the release from WellSky, we may or may not be able to change all the reports that we need to change, and so there may be some delays. That scope is being assessed, and we'll continue to do that assessment over the summer leading up to October 1st. There's a question from I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Arel. For data quality, does the answer client prefers not to answer show up as an error? So right now in data quality, the answer client prefers not to answer isn't one of the current data standard options. So the one that exists now is called client refused, and I believe that one is counted as missing information currently. And so as we revise the data quality reporting, the new answer would basically replace the old one. So yes, it would continue to be treated as an error. And we can talk more about that as we get into the data quality stuff. Any questions on either the assessments or the reporting? And then as far as training goes, the training will need to be revised to reflect the data standards changes since assessments will be changing and how data is collected will be changing. And we'll be sending out a survey among the ATAs and maybe others in the community to identify other training or webinars that might be useful in addition to changing the standard new user training or things like that. And some questions that we might include in there are, should there be things that just cover the data standards changes for 2024? Should we do things that are program type specific to just focus on the changes that people will see reflected in the way they do data entry for certain types of projects? Or what other things would you all like to see in terms of additional training, webinars, documentation, things like that, that would help smooth the transition for when this goes live on October 1st. Questions on that? So if it wasn't clear from the last 3 slides, this data standards update is going to occupy a significant amount of our time over the next several months, both reviewing the data, reviewing the reports, reviewing all the assessments and things like that, and making sure that we're positioned for whenever WellSky releases the new version that has all this stuff in it. The things that we would suggest for your agencies to start doing is to review the HUD documentation at the links that we provided, and review or revise your intake data collection and or mapping of your case data into HMIS. I'm guessing particularly for things like race and ethnicity, not all of your internal systems are changing to combine the two. So there may be some changes that you need to make in how you assemble the data to get into the HMIS. If there are report reviews that we need you involved in, please help us by participating in those so we make sure the changes are implemented in a way that makes the report still useful. Provide training or feedback on training that might be needed for your agency. Identify any of the reports that are critical to your operations so we can make sure those get prioritized in terms of sequencing of how we work on those. And to reduce the workload so we don't process projects that aren't really in use anymore. If you could let us know of any non-operational projects that don't need to be updated. There's a question in the question box from Erica. Does the HMIS committee still hold meetings once a month? Yes, they do. It's the sorry. So Hebron has asked a question, will you create a revised universal intake document? And Alex has responded to that question, yes. The ATA meetings are every 2 months. Aziza has asked how to get signed up for the HMIS committees. There's only one HMIS governance committee that has stakeholders from different interest groups. I believe the meetings are open, but I can get you information on when those meetings are. I believe they're published in the weekly newsletter, and we can get you more information about those. Any questions on any of the suggested actions? Anything that you all can think of that we should add to this list for things that need to be reviewed within your agency based on the data standards changes? Yes, we can distribute the information on the HMIS committee to everyone. Other questions? Okay, moving on to data quality. The calendar year 2022 data quality processing closed on May 19th, last Friday. We got information submitted for 237 projects via email. Thank you very much for your participation. We're tabulating the results and we'll post them tomorrow. In terms of next steps, since we haven't done it in a while, what I want to do is pause and get some feedback from the ATAs to see if there are improvements we can make for the next round. So we'll circulate the survey URL for that. Are there issues with or changes for reports to make sure the data that we just went through is accurate? Are there process improvements that we can make to make it less labor intensive or streamline things? And is there additional training that we can provide as to what's in the reports and whatever the corrective measures are for some of those items? Just to note, there was some confusion in a lot of the help desk tickets that we got about how to correct income assessment and income sub-assessment and other areas where responses were related and needed to match up. And so there may be other areas that those of you who participated in it might have encountered. So if you can please let us know any of those areas that need clarification. Aziza has a question. Can you speak about why timeliness is a part of this data quality process? Data quality process has been defined by the continuum of care to include certain kinds of metrics. And among those is the timeliness of data entry for several items in the assessments. So that's why we included timeliness as part of this data quality process. Does that answer your question, Aziza, or is there different? Juanita has a question, should all ATAs have access to business objects? The answer to that is yes. So if you don't, please let us know and we can correct that. Aziza says there's confusion about what the expectation around timeliness is, and it's not an area that folks can change. That's correct. We're measuring how it's being done, and so we can also, I believe it's part of the data quality documentation as to what the standard for timeliness is, but we can republish that. Vernon said, in response to more streamlined, perhaps make children of self carry over more typically shared data. I'm not sure what that means, but we can talk about that offline and as part of the survey. Steven says, my associate doesn't have access to business objects. Is it a simple request? Just email the help desk, but there may be some additional training that would make sense to go through. Arel has a question out of curiosity, can ATAs get access to the backdate function? Yes, I believe so, but let's talk about that offline as to what needs to be backdated and make sure we're not creating other data issues. So back to the data quality slide. For the next round, I propose that we do the first 6 months of this calendar year in July after review of the survey results, and then get on standard quarterly cadence. I don't want to put people through back-to-back months of doing data quality stuff if we can avoid it. A reminder that the business objects data quality reports can be run at any time for your projects. It doesn't have to be during the actual data quality session, so you can keep track of where things are on whatever cadence and however regularly you would like to do it. Speaking of the timeliness reports, I know those are not generally, well, they're not available to run through business objects. If it would be helpful to have those distributed on a regular basis, monthly, weekly, whatever makes sense, we can certainly look at doing that kind of an implementation, and we'll make that part of the survey to get responses to that. But if that makes sense to see what the timeliness looks like on a more regular basis, we can make those reports available and distribute them on whatever regularity makes sense for everyone. Thank you, Aziza. Any other questions about data quality at this point? So Sharice asked a question why we eliminated the 2 rounds for submitting data quality reports. The tabulation process for us is very labor intensive. And since you can see what your results are inside of the data quality report itself, we thought they were of limited utility. And so if it's useful for everyone to do it, we can add that to the survey to see if you'd like to go back to having 2 rounds. I just thought it was a lot of extra work and I didn't see a lot of usefulness out of it, but that's something we can add to the survey to get everyone's opinion on it. Lucas has a question about LEI income question. Data quality and local valuation instrument are 2 different things. So we're not currently talking about LEI. But we can talk offline, Lucas, about what your questions are about the income question. Sarah's asking, could there be a user group to look at HMIS data quality? So for data quality and training and things like that, we're looking into what the best way to do those kinds of things are to collect more input from the ATAs and other folks in the community. So short answer is yes, there could be. I want to make sure that we're operating within the governance of the HMIS committee and things like that, and working through all that stuff to make sure that, that we don't run afoul of any of those kinds of things. But yes, we've been considering putting together different kinds of committees to help steer these processes. Juanita is asking, what does the peer-peer group work on? I'm not familiar with the peer-peer group, so I don't know how to answer that question. Our next topic is duplicate client merge. We've reviewed and revised our process for merging duplicate HMIS clients. Keep in mind that the client merge is not reversible, so we wanted to make sure that we're doing it correctly and collecting all the information we needed to. So we're going to accept merge requests only from ATAs. For clients that span agencies, we want to make sure all the ATAs from all the agencies affected are in the loop. We've created a new form to collect data for the merge request along with a help desk article. The article that has a link to the form is at that URL, and again, we'll publish that, and it's in these slides. It will also be distributed to everyone. If one of the client records is locked, the merge will not be performed. And if we don't have sufficient data regarding how to do the merge, we won't proceed until we do have all the data that we need. Betsy is asking just for agencies that the client is currently enrolled with. I don't know that we can limit it to just current enrollment if the enrollments are really old. I don't know that the other ATAs will care, but we want to at least involve them in communication that these client records are being merged so that they know for any of their reporting or things like that, as things start getting affected, that they know that this operation was conducted on a client that they had enrolled in one of their projects. We don't know. Betsy says we don't always know the other ATs. We'll coordinate that on our end. Yes, that's part of what we do as part of our process, is do a lookup on the client and see how many other agencies are affected and things like that. So yes, we'll coordinate that piece of it. Aziz is asking, how will this merge impact assessments that may be connected to a merged client record? Generally speaking, they do not, because the way the visibility is set up, your reporting and your view of the data for that client is still limited to your agency. But that's one of the things we want to take a look at and make sure of as we're merging things that cross agencies, that we don't have any discrepancies like that. The merge process will highlight where there are assessments in conflict or where other conflicts occur, and that's why we want to be careful about how we do it. And if we do get any of those errors, we won't do the merge. Client record locks. This is kind of related to the merge. We've noticed an increase in requests to grant access to client records. And I believe that because of the number of client records that are locked and not visible to other agencies, it's resulting in a lot more clients being created where we could be using the existing client record. So a reminder that client records should be locked under the following conditions. The client chose not to share data in their release of information. They're a domestic violence or gender-based violence survivor, or they have HIV or AIDS. Betsy says they also lock unaccompanied minor files. Thanks, I can add that in. But other than that, clients should really not be locked under normal operating circumstances. It can create this issue of lots of duplicate clients can be generated. We also identified that some agencies are configured in HMIS to lock all the new client records they create, which can create obvious problems. We're contacting those agencies and removing that configuration unless the situation requires it going forward. So please remind users not to lock client records except in those above cases. And again, I'll add in the unaccompanied minor one. Thank you, Betsy. And to obtain the ROI data for all enrollments. So as we go through checking to make sure that the ROI is consistent with the client lock status, we actually have the ROI data for every one of the enrollments that occurs. Any questions on that? And last slide that we have is about training. We've already discussed doing some additional training and revision of training surrounding the HUD data standard changes. Any additional data quality training we might do as part of the DQ survey that we'll be distributing. We're also working on revised training on sub-assessments and other revisions. Looking how to get, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at how to get feedback from ATAs and other folks in the community about training changes and reviewing what we're doing with training and things like that. So we'll provide that information in a separate communication as we work through making sure we're following all the governance things in how we form those groups and committees and things like that. Any question on training? That's all I have. Any other general questions or things, or else you can have 4 minutes of your day back. And again, I will be creating a PDF and distributing that to everyone who's invited to this meeting later on today. Juanita, we can contact you about getting the ATAs set up at your agency and doing any additional training. Juanita, I'm sorry, we'll go back to your question. So my understanding on earned income is that it's according to the HUD standard and maybe some COC documentation that adult members of the household that are not head of household, and I believe it applies to minors also, but we can look into this and provide a specific thing via email, especially if you can open up a help desk ticket, that income only counts if it goes towards supporting the housing, like paying for rent or other things associated with housing. But we can double check that and get you a specific response on that. Sandra has a question. Will HUD APR have some of the error data fields fixed? I'm not sure what that means. If you could open up a ticket with the help desk, we can look into whatever your specific issues are with the APR. And Perlene, in terms of training, we can contact you and have Rochelle in particular talk about what the training needs might be within your agency. Any other questions? Okay, thank you everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.